4 years ago, a mod called Universal Controller Fix was standardized by the Melee community. This marked the first time a software mod was standardized in any capacity. UCF came during a conservative time period in which game mods were unheard of in general. The box, for example, had yet to be legalized, and practically anything that involved changing Melee was considered controversial. The caution with which software mods had to be approached back then can be seen in UCF's philosophy. The UCF website contains multiple reassurances that UCF doesn't cause your controller to exceed what a good controller is capable of, and that nothing within UCF goes beyond what is possible in vanilla Melee. However, these reassurances are contradicted further down on the same page where it says, the window for dashback has been increased from 1 frame to 2 frames, and the shield drop threshold has been increased as well. What this contradiction suggests is that the UCF team is downplaying their mod's rationale. I can't fault them for taking this approach during a time when people were hesitant to accept any type of software mod, but now that 4 years have passed, it's worth reevaluating UCF. I'll start by telling you that the claim that UCF simply causes your controller to tie the best controller isn't true, and that UCF actually causes your controller to exceed what's possible on vanilla in quite a few ways. This leads me to the true rationale behind UCF, which is more complicated than what the website suggests. The true rationale behind UCF is to repair mechanics that suffer from the polling dilemma or the small range dilemma by buffing them to the point that they can be performed 100% of the time. This causes hardware inconsistencies to be fixed along the way. To show you what I mean, let's go over the 3 mechanics UCF currently fixes: Dashback, Wiggle Out of Tumble, and Shield Drop. Dashback and Wiggle both suffer from the polling dilemma, while Shield Drop suffers from the small range dilemma. To be exact, Dashback and Wiggle both suffer from the exact same polling dilemma. This dilemma has to do with the fact that in order to perform these techniques on vanilla, your analog stick has to be pulled in the dead zone followed by the zone at the far end. If at any point your analog stick is red while it's hovering above the zone in the middle, then your dashback or wiggle will fail. UCF fixes this by increasing these techniques to a 2-frame window. What this means is that it's fine for your analog stick to be red in the middle zone for a frame on UCF, as your dashback or wiggle will still succeed afterward. The explanation I just gave proves that UCF doesn't just tie what's possible on vanilla, but rather reduces the difficulty of techniques that need to have their difficulty reduced so they can be performed consistently. I personally believe the way UCF fixes dashback and wiggle is fine, as increasing the window for these techniques to 2 frames is straightforward enough. However, UCF's shield drop fix is where I begin to take issue with UCF's implementation. This fix works by increasing vanilla Melee's shield drop range from 3 Y values to 11 Y values. Although this may seem generous enough, I actually believe UCF should be even more shameless by making its shield drop range even bigger. I say this because UCF seems to look to preserve some sort of difficulty when shield dropping by choosing an arbitrary range. However, many players have pointed out that UCF's shield drop range fails to fully equalize all controllers. UCF's range is still small enough that a notch right in the middle of its range would still have a notable advantage over a notch toward the far end, for example. This is why I believe UCF should shamelessly increase its shield drop range so that it reaches the very bottom of the quadrant. Since the real goal of UCF is to make sure the techniques it fixes succeed 100% of the time, this would be a perfectly fine change. Another reason I believe this change is fine is the fact that the box has become commonplace. On the box, you can shield drop by inputting down and to the side, which is unmissable. It's only fair to unite GameCube controllers with the box at that point by increasing the shield drop range as much as possible. That brings me to the more interesting part of this video. As I've explained, the goal of UCF is to fix mechanics that suffer from either the polling dilemma or the small range dilemma such that they can succeed 100% of the time. The question at that point is, which other mechanics suffer from these issues and can be fixed in a reasonable way? Currently, I believe there are 2, Dashback out of crouch and 1.0 Cardinal. These 2 mechanics are not only significant, but also need to be changed so that they can be performed consistently. I'll start by explaining dashback out of crouch. This is an important technique when it comes to tech chasing. However, dashback out of crouch will fail if you enter a state called squat RV. Squat RV is the animation in which your character stands up from crouch. It's impossible to dash back from this animation, and so you'll have to avoid it. The way to avoid squat RV is to roll your analog stick along the bottom of the rim. This is the proper method because after initiating crouch in the green area, you can raise your analog stick up to the yellow area while still remaining in crouch. However, if you raise your analog stick up any further than that, you'll enter squat RV. Rolling your analog stick along the bottom of the rim helps you avoid the squat RV range. However, there is a problem with this method that can't be avoided. The problem has to do with the fact that there are 2 Y values above the range that lets you remain in crouch that aren't yet in dash territory. What this means is that even if you take the ideal travel route, your analog stick will still have to travel across these Y values. If your analog stick is then pulled while it's above these Y values, you'll enter squat RV and your dashback out of crouch will fail. Because it's impossible to tell when this will happen, dashback out of crouch is an inherently unfair mechanic. I tested dashback out of crouch a bunch and found that it fails about 5 to 10% of the time because of these Y values. Although this isn't the end of the world, it's still something that should be fixed in principle. The best way to do this is to increase the range that lets you remain in crouch by 2 Y values. This won't realistically affect anything outside of fixing the issue I just described with dashback out of crouch. The next and last mechanic that I believe should be fixed is 1.0 Cardinal. I've been adamant about fixing 1.0 ever since 2017, but back then the mechanic wasn't as well understood. 1.0 refers to the final value within each cardinal, which is the ideal value to pinpoint in just about every situation. 1.0 is about 1% better than the value before it when it comes to things like dash speed and DI, but the issue is that it's difficult to pinpoint because it's only a single value. 1.0 first garnered attention because of the box's ability to pinpoint it consistently. However, this led to the community overlooking the fact that 1.0 is a GameCube controller disparity as well. Some GameCube controllers are exceptionally good at pinpointing 1.0 due to favorable hardware, while others will struggle to pinpoint 1.0 at all. This means that 1.0 behaves similarly to Shield Drop in that it suffers from the small range dilemma. The best way to fix 1.0 is to reprogram something called clamping. I'd like to give credit to TauCon for explaining clamping to me. The way clamping works is as follows. Even outside of the analog stick's unit circle, there are coordinates that can be read on a hardware level. The values being displayed in red would normally redirect to the value before 1.0, but if clamping is reprogrammed, then they can redirect to 1.0 itself. This is the cleanest solution to the 1.0 cardinal disparity. One last thing I should address is why I believe it's correct to standardize 1.0 rather than the value that comes before it. Some people had proposed standardizing the smaller value rather than 1.0. However, this wouldn't be consistent with the rest of UCF's rationale. As we've seen, UCF fixes mechanics by buffing them rather than nerfing them, and so standardizing the value before 1.0 would be the equivalent of standardizing 0% dashback. If the mod is to remain consistent throughout, then the right move would be to standardize 1.0. To recap this video, the true goal of UCF is a bit different from what is advertised. UCF's goal isn't to tie the best GameCube controller, but rather to repair mechanics that suffer from the polling dilemma and the small range dilemma such that these dilemmas don't exist anymore. UCF does a fine job of this with dashback and wiggle, but its Shield Drop mod uses an arbitrary range which should be increased. UCF should also introduce fixes for dashback out of crouch and 1.0 Cardinal, as these mechanics meet its criteria. Dashback out of crouch should be fixed by increasing the range that lets you remain in crouch by 2 Y values so that the element of luck is removed. From there, Shield Drop in 1.0 should be fixed by maximizing the ranges for these techniques. Although this may seem like overkill, I want to reiterate that anything less than the ranges being shown is arbitrary, and that the goal of UCF is to make sure these techniques succeed 100% of the time. It's also only fair that the GameCube controller is given these ranges when you consider the fact that the box will always succeed these techniques. Uniting the GameCube controller with the box should be a priority now that Melee is being played in the modern era. One last thing I should mention is that this is the second video in a 4-part series on software mods and rule set changes that I'd like to see implemented. The next video, which will unveil a game-changing new mod, will be released on Tuesday, October 5th. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy this type of Melee content.